I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank Patricia for being here. And I told her I would do this because I actually met Patricia before I met her. And the way I met her is a mutual friend of ours, Derek Bell, walked up to me. I was at Harvard at the time, and walked up to me and gave me this typescript. He said, "You need to read this. You need to read this. This woman's great." And if you open up your copy of The Alchemy of Race and Rights, which I'm sure you all have with you, you will see what Derek gave me on the frontispiece, basically. So it's fabulous.
That's amazing. Jerry, I want to thank Jerry, and I want to thank Windham Campbell for making this amazing event even possible, and addressing this issue in this time. But actually, I will bet that was typewritten.
It was typewritten.
Yeah, because this is before Alchemy of Race and Right was actually published. I was still a student of Derek Bell's at that point. Yeah, so this is a long time ago.
It was a long time ago.
Jerry just told me the story. I had no idea that's how he first
and it was a typescript.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Anyway, what I thought I'd do, and I did a number of things in anticipation, and we don't need to follow this path, was to obviously go through all of Patricia's work and trace the themes of her work, both the continuities and discontinuities, and the change in subject, in perspective. And the one thing I recognize, and maybe this will be the first question, is as her investigations have changed, the one thing you notice is the different disciplines that she brings to bear on the questions she's asking. So initially, you could say she's a lawyer, right? And she's analyzing the work as a lawyer and brings the technique of storytelling to both investigate the logical structure or the illogical structure sometimes of legal arguments, and to make them more complex. But as you read on through her piece, she brings the investigation of artifacts and different. I mean, it's like you're walking through a museum, right? And you say, what does this mean? But one theme that has remained constant, right, is her focus on the black body and the way in which the law and politics and violence is inscribed on the black body in all of its various ways. So maybe you can talk about how you moved from discipline to discipline and how it informed your work.
I don't think I consciously moved from discipline to discipline. I kept looking for resources to inform what I was experiencing. And so, just to put this in context, when I was in law school, there were so few African Americans. There were so few indigenous people. I think you were the only one I knew for years in the law school context. Then came Robert Williams. There were almost no Asians or South Asians when I was in law school, at any rate. There were 2 Latinos whom I met. And remember, this was also an era in which women were only 8% of the law school class. So this was a world that had been extraordinarily uniform and carefully curated to make certain things apparent to certain sets of eyes and not so apparent to others. So our very existence there was a daily coping with explaining myself or explaining cases from different perspectives. And I think one of the most famous examples of that, it's now been analyzed thoroughly, is a case called Williams versus Walker Thomas, about a woman who bought a set of furniture from a furniture store that charged her incredibly usurious rates. And the particular structure of this extraction was that when she got credit, and she kept paying, she never could pay off the whole balance because everything she had ever purchased from the store over a decade they took a little piece. So she paid $10 toward the diminishment of the debt. Actually, 1 cent of it went to the first record player she bought. 3 cents went to the sofa. So when she defaulted at all by as much as half a dollar, they could recoup the entire contents of her apartment, from the baby crib to the, whatever. And the reception among most of my classmates, the majority of my classmates, was, well, this was a foolish bargain. So she was a foolish transactor, a bad contractor, and this is on her. And again, that's a contractarian perspective that places the risk on the voluntary undertaking. I mean, contract is about a sumsit, the old writ of a sumsit, that he or she assumes. So you assumed the risk, and therefore it's on you. And a lot of us, who came from different environments, looked and said, no, this is actually a particular consumer practice. And it's against, you don't find this downtown at Jordan Marsh. You don't find this, at large department stores. You find it aimed at very particular audiences. And it's a practice that doesn't permit you ever to win, and it impoverishes you and keeps you in this cycle. And so maybe there's something we can talk about, the regulatory practice that actually goes, back decades, of how much interest, even as a biblical matter, that you can take or not take, that this is an ethical violation, of a norm. And that started a conversation. Some people now call that critical race theory. But it was, to me, the start of a conversation of what happens when you put populations from different experiences, different backgrounds, different understanding, when you look at people in different ways. And we all come from very segregated neighborhoods in this country still. So when you get us out of those neighborhoods, and in universities or law school classrooms, we encounter each other for the first time, this is some of what happens. I thought this was remarkably positive. Derek Bell was a very important mentor in my life. He was the first African-American professor at Harvard, and certainly the first tenured African-American professor at Harvard. And he had extraordinary patience and generosity with everybody, and he really made the space for those conversations to come alive, with a kind of gentility and gentlemanliness that drew everybody in. And one of the things that really hurts me in this day and age is to see that memory completely erased or turned into something it wasn't. And that conversation wasn't just among African American students. There weren't enough of us to have a sustained conversation. This was a conversation that included everybody, that included white students, male students, female students, students from whatever diversity there was at that time, which then expanded over the years as the university made space for us. Whatever names of derogation you can pin to those practices now, it was an open door. And it also, and this was not just about racial inclusion or national inclusion, it was also the beginning of the erosion of secret societies. When we were in law school, there were all these secret societies where, you would discover later that the Secretary of State had come and was invited to a dinner where some students and some faculty would come and discuss the case that we were studying in class the next day. But none of us knew it. And I remember discovering this because Derek Bell mentioned that he was never invited to these particular things. And so these practices of not just, exclusion at the level of the doors of the law school, but at the multiple circles of heaven, or or hell. That there were all these stages of inclusion and conversations that were occurring that were quite the legacy of class divisions or privilege divisions, or who's in and who's out in terms of political matters, were something that we were questioning, and I think for the ultimate good. And this, was a controversy, but it was never the kind of controversy it is now.
Right.
And one of the things that really, really disturbs me is that was in I graduated in 1975, so that was a long time, it was the 70s. And, a lot of us have continued to write. I think of it as critical race conversation. There's not really a unifying theory to critical race theory, but it was, it wasn't a big deal.
Right.
And now what's happened is there was a specific intervention in the year 2000.
Right.
And the Manhattan Institute had a provocateur named Christopher Rufo, and he really wrote the script for Donald Trump, who then wrote an executive order that said, we are going to take critical race theory, and you can read it. I mean, if you know anything about critical race theory, this was a specific Orwellian moment when he said, we're going to take that term, we're going to rebrand it, we're going to remake it into something that everybody in the Americans will associate with negative things. Everything that Americans hate will now be called critical race theory. So this is, 2 legs, 4 legs. It's
Right.
really, it's complete Orwell. Turn the meaning upside down. And they had the power of media to infuse this understanding of it throughout the country.
And I think they had the power to circulate that
Yes.
idea.
Yeah.
Basically to turn critical race theory into a rag bag.
Yeah.
Right, and they would stuff everything that they wanted to stuff in it. But you said it already, but you say it in I forget which essay, that in some ways, calling it critical race theory assumes that there's a specific set of analytic devices that you
Right.
use to interrogate questions. But it really did arise, right, as more of a critical race conversation.
Yeah.
And so the dialogic
Yeah.
method was in fact really important. And but it permitted questions which hadn't been asked before to be asked, right? And for people to ask them in good faith,
Yes.
right? Which was critical. If I can use critical, important, right? That you assumed that there was a good faith among the various people who were conversing. The elimination of that,
Yes.
I think, has been one of the most detrimental effects of the attempt to characterize critical race theory as some, boogeyman.
To Willie Hortonize it.
To Willie Hortonize it.
And to make it an exclusively black thing. Because critical race theorists include people like Mari Matsuda, Gary Peller, who was white. A whole range of voices were in this and were called critical race theory.
Right.
And then to some extent it fractured as more and more people came and became admitted into law schools. So now there was critical lat theory, so-called
Lat-crit, right.
Lat-crit, critical feminist voices, and they were just, and everybody used to have this conversation in the same room at the same time.
Right.
And
Well, it was possible for all us to be
to
in
fit in the
a
same
room.
There were so few, literally there were so few. Yeah.
That was one of the.
But each of us went our own ways in some ways and continued to write. And then this rediscovery in which critical race or critical theory of one sort or another became, I don't know, all black all the time, was a specific political intervention
Right.
to discredit not even us, but the entire civil rights movement.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's back up a little bit, though. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between critical race theory
Yes.
and critical legal studies.
Oh, yes. Where did the term even come from? I don't think any of us, including Derek Bell, actually used that term. I mean, that came years after I think there were a couple of, meetings. But it was actually, the controversy when I was in law school was critical legal studies. And that really was united by a kind of theory. And that was sort of Frankfurt School.
Frankfurt School,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. And that included an entirely white conversation, as far as I'm aware of. I mean, but that was Duncan Kennedy, Roberto Unger, Morton Horowitz,
Peter Gable.
Peter Gable. I think Alan Dershowitz at one point was part of this, wasn't he? Again, we've all gone our separate ways over time. Yeah. But critical legal studies was very controversial because they were faculty, a large number of whom were faculty at Harvard, having a conversation with the senior faculty that really was quite ideological and became, it had a certain controversy. But,
Well, yeah,
but we weren't part of that.
Right. No, they were challenging
Yeah.
liberal legalism, right?
Yeah.
Right. But it was students like Patricia and Kimberly,
Yeah.
right, who asked the question, which was, almost like, letting a bad odor into the room, right? What about race?
Yeah.
And how does what's critical legal studies? How does it fold questions of race into the critique?
Yes.
And it was almost like you were impolite to ask.
Right, because they were talking about inclusion in a way that we kept saying, hello, where do we fit into this? And it was just that, a question.
Right.
Where do we fit into this?
And so it's the linkage, I think, between critical legal studies and then the questioning of critical legal studies that gave birth to the nomenclature, right?
Yes, the nomenclature of critical race
race
studies.
theory.
Yeah.
Right. But one of the things that it seems to me that your work does, really importantly, but that what critical race theory has tried to do, right, is to point out, well, what I say to my students, and some of them are back there, right, is all I'm trying to understand is what I see on the street, right? That's all I'm trying to understand. So it's not a grand theory, right? I'm trying to see the world as it is and to make sense of it, right? But also to see how the law, in many ways, structures, and this is one of the very important parts of your work, how the law structures the way we see things in the street, and how race is deeply implicated in those structures. Your work in contracts is obviously critical to that. But,
Yeah.
I mean, you started work at the Western Center on Law and Property, right?
It was
in
even
LA.
before that. I was a deputy city attorney for Los Angeles, and then I went to Western Center on Law and Poverty. Yeah.
Now, I'm from California as well, right?
Yeah,
and it's very funny because the way in which racial issues evolve or emerge in the West, in California,
Yeah.
right, is radically different than the way they emerge, right?
Yeah.
Which means if in fact there's a unifying theory,
Yeah.
right, you have to figure out a way to talk about it, which
Yeah.
I think you did. Now, one of the things I want to do, I mean, I'd love to, talk about one of the things that Patricia has done, I think, is very important. Is that she's expanded the reach of critical race theory by incorporating the insights of other disciplines and using some of those techniques to explore. But what I want to talk a little bit about the history of it, but I also want us to get to where we are now, right?
Yeah.
Because where we are now is a very funny place. It's a very funny place, right? So I don't know. I mean, what was the political content of critical race theory, and how has that been changed contemporarily?
I mean, it's a
small
good question. No, because I don't consider myself an ideologue. I don't consider myself a theorist, although I'm probably more of a theorist than I was when I was in practice. But the things to which I was exposed when I worked in those offices, I worked for the city attorney's office as a consumer advocate, and one of the major things that I did was, property displacements, lien laws, people who were being cheated, and this was when large Black and Hispanic populations were being displaced from their houses by mortgage liens. It was sort of the subprime mortgage scandal.
Right.
There was that back in the 70s, and so I was working on that. When I worked for the Western Center on Law and Poverty, I worked on a case involving the sterilization at USC of tons of mostly Hispanic women, because the head of gynecology and obstetrics had a spoken policy. He actually wrote it out that you convince any woman who has 3 children or more and who's on welfare to get sterilized. And the contracts, the so-called consent forms that they signed under those circumstances were horrendous. I mean, there were no translators. You know, one said, well, you know, we had a nurse who spoke Portuguese, and that's just like Spanish. So, you know, it was they got consents while people were under anesthesia. I mean, they got consent from, you know, children who were in the waiting room. I mean, it was just a horrendous situation, and so. That's a sort of political lesson, but it wasn't that I was theorizing while approaching these cases. It gave me insight in ways that then made me, you know, when I think the turning point in my own writing career was when, and I've said this before on this stage, you know, I found, or my sister found the contract of sale of my great-great-grandmother. And, you know, this contract was in the archives, and that's my relationship to the importance of archives, of my great-great-grandfather, whom my family only knew as the master. In other words, it was described entirely as a commercial relationship, that he owned her. And in our family memory, he was the master, the owner of the plantation, but she was not what she was described in other literature as the breeding wench, which was actually going to increase his inventory. And so that palpable sense of her as property, and how even my family memory had carried it forward as the master rather than a really broken family relationship of raping an 11-year-old so that by the time she was 13, she had an 11-month child who was listed in the property of his living room. You know, because these property lists in that time went around the room and said one sofa, one parlor slave, one, you know, Chinese vase, you know. and so you were just listed as part of that inventory. You know, I've never written the same since. And so, you know, I don't know if that's a structural analysis, but it certainly affects, I think, the way we see and how family memory is bent or can be informed by a more nuanced understanding of, and our national history. Why do we have among the highest rates of child abuse, sexual abuse? It seems to me that, you know, when you break this down for these historical experiences, it follows a very linear line, and it's more prevalent in certain geographies. The excuses made are more prevalent in, you know, given certain family histories. It shouldn't be a great mystery. And it's something we need to address compassionately, but fully. But this kind of, we can't have anything that makes us hot under the collar is ridiculous.
In 30 states, I think what you've just said would be prohibited.
Yes. Yes.
Right? Because it might make some of you out there feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right?
Even at your age, because
right. So, but what I want you to think about that construction, right? What that says is your feelings get to be an arbiter of truth, right? As opposed to the historical truth itself being made available and then having to process it. So suddenly the emotional response of the audience becomes the criteria by which what you can teach, right, is determined.
Yeah.
That's a very strange, it seems to me, that's a very strange metric for determining
and
what you can teach.
And it's transformed what we mean by there's nothing substantive. It's all over the place because it is a legislation of fear, a legislation of emotion. The fact of what happened is no longer epistemic; it is completely emotional. Right. And you know, and it's arbitrary. It's haptic, and that's not a stable educational. It can't be a goal anymore. And
to focus on one word you just said, right? It's not stable.
Yeah.
Right. So in fact, the metric by which you're going to judge what is permissible and what's not permissible to be taught, right, is floating. Right. And it's floating on other things in the society. Right.
Well, and the instability of it is now being attempted to be tacked down in some way. And that's why you can't use words like diversity, you can't use words like black, you can't talk about race, you can't talk about equity. And to my amusement, you can't even use it in the tax code. They had to put it back in the tax code after the buoyant tech machines eliminated diversity, equity from the tax code, diverse investments and equities.
The term eliminating equity from the tax code might have serious consequences. I'm just saying,
And so, so there's something nonsensical and literal and, again, not stable and substantive in a way that is attached to history. So these become floating signifiers at the very best. Yeah.
Right. Which is to say, not critical.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's what Stuart Hall once described as, the issue of race as a floating signifier.
Right.
He wrote a wonderful essay on that.
Now early on, right, you were characterized as a defender of rights, because one of the critiques of critical legal studies was a kind of full-throated critique of rights in legal analysis and in the regulation of society, right? And Patricia wrote a piece that people said, well, wait a minute, why is she defending something that we said is slippery and doesn't really work?
Well, who's the we in that, though? I mean,
I'm glad you picked that up.
Yeah, no, there was a debate, about, and that really is where the role of critical legal studies as opposed to critical race theory comes in, because critical legal studies was about the indeterminacy of law. Everything is indeterminate. And my experience as a civil rights baby, as the great-grandchild of slaves, I mean, I actually have 3 pictures of great-grandparents who were born in slavery, which is just such a rare phenomenon. And that was so real to me that what transformed their status or what they worked for was some hook, which they called rights, to be able to hook their claims to. And the argument we were having was about the indeterminacy of language, which I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge, but the law operates in very particular ways, and you needed some stability of what we meant by rights, and to draw a line through what it meant to be completely unrighted as a sentient body, who could be just as easily characterized as a piece of property, as opposed to a constitutional right of the integrity of the body with autonomy and the powers of choice.
Right.
And so it doesn't seem controversial now, but it was, I think, this theoretical clash that is about language and semiotics. And it's wonderful to have that debate, but the idea that it would, it's like so many debates, it got divided into rights or no rights, as opposed to something more subtle about the way in which language and rules and norms operate.
And I think one of the things that made your intervention so powerful was basically, I'm not giving up the theoretical sophistication of the argument, but what I am going to do is to tell you that it's rooted in material reality.
Yeah.
And you have to come to terms with material reality and not pretend that it's just floating in the air. Right?
Or if it's floating, you have to give it enough context for it to make sense. I mean, the story of Beloved is based on a real legal case, right? And so this woman escaped her master or her owner, or whatever you want to put it, but the father of her children, the white slave owner, had raped her a number of times. She was brutally abused and fled with those children into Canada, or into free territory, into Ohio. And then the slave catchers under the Fugitive Slave Act caught her, and as they were coming to find her in her hiding place, she attempted to kill all 3 of her children rather than have them go back to slavery. And so the ghostliness of that trauma is the story of the ghost that haunts Toni Morrison's book, Beloved. In the real case, however, Margaret Garner, the mother, was put on trial, or the there were actually two competing legal forces. One was to put her on trial for murder, and her defense lawyers wanted her to be put on trial for murder, because the other side of the case was that she was a piece of property, and so it was merely a matter of bailment. Should she be delivered back, like a package, like a UPS package, to her owner? And so her defense attorneys actually wanted her to be tried for murder because they said that that would mean that the law was treating her as a human being. That a murder would actually have, the mens rea, the state of, that you would have a human sense of intentionality and volition attributed to her, and then the jury could decide, and they thought the jury would be sympathetic to the circumstances. Then she could bring in all the facts of her rape and the suffering that she'd been through. And of course, they didn't give her the power to be, to be tried for murder, and instead, she was simply returned to her master, and all the descriptions of the court records are literally not about her claim. They're about the fact that she was, again, I keep thinking of UPS, that she was, packaged carefully and returned without damage to her master. Yeah, right. It was literally without. So it was, but the language is from the law of bailment rather than the language of human rights. And so we're always fighting about language, and what rights mean.
Right.
Yeah.
But to that point, I mean, your discussion of the Fugitive Slave Act, is exactly to that point, right?
Yes.
Because if you are a runaway slave, right, you are stealing yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. You are the thief of yourself.
Yeah. And that's what Frederick Douglass wrote.
Exactly.
He said, I'm a thief of this arm, this leg. When he escaped, he framed it as stealing himself from the property of his master. Right. Diminishing the property of his master.
Which is why rescuing rights was a way to give you a kind of subjectivity within a system, right, that required, at minimum, the dignity of acknowledging that you're in a position to make these kinds of claims. Right? Which is just like beloved. Yeah. Which is, but the reason it was controversial, Patricia's intervention was controversial, was because I think you insisted on saying that if you're going to study law, right, law is not philosophy, right? Law is about how you regulate things in the world, and you have to come to terms with things in the world, right, including the relations, the social relations that they reproduce.
And it's also true, I gave the whole notion of rights very playful, and that's probably where it was interdisciplinary. I gave it a very poetic definition. I said, give rights to, spirits, give rights to flowers, give rights to slaves. If you're going to give rights to property, basically. And it's. I'm not literally insisting on that, but if we're going to do this, let's recognize that power of the play of language as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, and that was, that was a critical moment.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I kind of choose a different word. That was an important moment, right, in the debate within what I'll call the progressive critique in law. Yeah. Right. That it required people to see that when we talk about law, right, we're not just talking about talking, right? We're talking about systems that actually have material consequences in the world, and you've got to come to terms with that, right? So I want to ask you about it, because you are probably the person who's most directly associated with this turn, which is the turn to storytelling.
I've been accused of that.
In legal scholarship, right? Something that Derek ultimately turned to, and was roundly criticized for. Right? So, what led you to choose that narrative form.
I didn't choose storytelling. I mean, it's true that I've been associated with that, but I didn't choose storytelling as a way of writing for purposes of legal writing. And in fact, my first writing in this genre wasn't for legal audiences. But I also came out of a place of a litigator. And when we were in law school, everything was theoretical. Everything was theoretical. We never learned trial techniques. Law school was not about that in those days. It was very, very, you learned abstract rules. You never saw them applied. And then you went to Wall Street. That was really what you did. And again, this encounter with a contract of sale that I had heard about from the maternal line of people describing it, her fate, that young slave girl's fate, came to me through my grandmother's and my mother's accounting. It was held like a precious object for us to remember and to monitor the borders of our own body. And when my sister found this contract, and we actually thought it was almost like an electrical force field that went through my body. It was, and can I just tell a little bit of a wordy story? But I've written about this, so some of you may have heard it. But basically, I have a friend whose husband was a survivor of the Holocaust, and he'd been an artist before he'd been put in Auschwitz. And after being liberated, he came to Los Angeles. But before he was imprisoned, he was a painter. He was in art school. When he came to Los Angeles, he became a costume designer. He never went back to painting as a profession, but he painted in his spare time. And she took me to his garage where he had literally hundreds of canvases. And the canvases were these brilliant landscapes. They were incredibly detailed. I mean, just everything was incredibly detailed. But in the middle of each one, there was a human-shaped blank space. And so my friend said, he never finishes anything. And I said, actually, that's the most complete expression of the erasure of humanity that I have ever seen. And so that happened when I was working in LA. That was a colleague when I was working in LA. But when I saw the contract that was in the National Archives, that was written by my great-great-grandfather to purchase this breeding wench, who was my great-great-grandmother, it was like that space in Ted's painting, suddenly it was like an earthquake. Her image, and I don't know whether this is really her image, but this image suddenly filled with a face that I associate with what must have been my great-great-grandmother. And so I didn't intentionally start writing just a story. It was a different kind of writing. And the first thing I ever wrote wasn't in a law review. My first account of that was in Signs, the Journal of Women's History. And that became the last chapter in. And actually, telling that story, I decided I was going to drop out of teaching law. I was teaching law by that point, and I was going to go get a PhD in comparative literature. And I went to the School of Criticism and Theory, which at that time was Dartmouth, and those of you who are in literature are more familiar with this, but I didn't know what it was, but it's really, it's great. And so but that's where Barbara Johnson, Marge Garber, these great figures in literature read that essay and said, you need to publish a book. And so they took me to the great Lindsay Waters, who was the humanities editor of Harvard Press. And he said, keep writing 11 other chapters and we'll have a dozen. And that's what became The Alchemy of Race and Right. So I wasn't writing for a legal audience. Right. And then I became labeled as a storyteller, and that's no way to be a lawyer. Right. And so, but I've braved that.
But that last point is absolutely important, right? Because what it as beautiful and as powerful as that book is, it became a way to criticize what critical race theorists were doing, right?
Yeah.
It is debasing
the
language of law,
yeah.
right? As opposed to saying, if you read this and follow the path through, your understanding of law is actually going to be enriched, right?
Yeah.
But it was rejected not just rejected, it was criticized, right?
There was a period of intense criticism. And public criticism.
Right.
I was torn apart in many media, in the Wall Street Journal and the newspaper. I did the Reith lectures in Britain, and at that time my encounter with Boris Johnson was, he was writing, he interviewed me for The Telegraph, for which he was writing at that time. Actually, in my most recent book, I have a little excerpt from the Daily Mail, from the Telegraph, of what I went through in that time, which was all about the critique of the style of writing.
Right.
It wasn't what I said, it was the style of writing. So it was almost like writing in a language of blasphemy. There was almost a religious overtone to it, if you know what I mean, in terms of there are those who read the Bible very literally, there are those who, are more Episcopalian or, Universalist, whatever. But I was in almost a theological debate about the power of language, but nobody was engaging with what to me was principally a description of how my family members were battered by different principles of interpretation in the law. Right. Yeah.
And when I said accused of debasing constitutional analysis, that's actually a quote from a critique that was made.
Yeah.
I dare say they learned to read. They learned to read subsequently. Anyway, I'm supposed to save 15 minutes for you all to ask questions. And so I think we're at that point. We have someone with a microphone back there. If there are any questions?
Raise your hands, and I'll try to be semi-fair.
Pat, when you spoke about your great-grandmother, which you did a few times, but when you specifically used the word rape, there was kind of a little ripple in the room, of course. And then later, you referenced how your grandmother and your mom kind of preserved for you and your sister the image of your great-grandmother. And then you said that you and your sister kind of used that in order to monitor the contours of your own bodies.
Yeah.
And that, for me, was really very powerful because it spoke to the ways in which your history, our history, affects how the relationships that we get to have, that we have with other people.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you might say a little bit more about that.
It's, I don't want to distinguish it too distinctly from what women go through generally. But yes, but I think that among Black women, there is, again, I cited Marion Hirsch and her description of the way in which post-Holocaust memory is sometimes experienced as post-memory, which is not actually the memory you yourself have, but the way in which your ancestry is narrated to you in a way that makes you very self-conscious of where you can go and where you can't go, what you can say and what you can't say, that you feel a hesitancy that you might not have words for that actually is anterior by several generations. That sort of thing. That trauma is, an injury, apparently psychoanalytically, that knocks that bypasses your language center, so that the expression of trauma, like PTSD, is reiterative behavior, and you repeat and you repeat, and I think that happens intergenerationally. So I think there are many manifestations of it, particularly among good girls of a particular class in the African American community. That you behave in a certain way, you hold your body in a certain way, you have to dress up for certain, in hyper attentive ways that is psychologically draining, I think, that is related to questions of colorism and resentments because the really unfortunate tragic mulattoes that were the produce of this, or the products of this, sometimes were treated better, or at least could work in the house as opposed to the hot fields. And these are intergenerational senses of divide that, linger as resentments to this day. And the aesthetics of how we're perceived in a society where aesthetics is so important, particularly for women, in terms of how you are treated or permitted to hold on to your body. So that's, I mean, this could be a very long answer in terms of those kinds of issues. Whether you're believed when you're assaulted, I mean, that's the other thing. There's a whole, I mean, that's before we even get to the, or just in terms of all of these really dominant narratives about how, no, Sally Hemings must have loved her master, and this is why it wasn't so bad, because actually the law simply said you couldn't marry, but I'm sure they were in love. Again, that sort of, that projection, it's exactly the dynamic that I identify in the concern about AI bots speaking things that really, the deceased or real people didn't say, that are disconnected from the actual sentiments, but that are substituted as, I think, apologies for unbelievable trauma and unforgivable behavior.
Question back there.
I know there's no such thing as a stupid question, but I think this feels like a stupid question. How do you define critical race theory? Because I know I'm going to have to talk about it when I go home and tell people, what lectures did I go to? So.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a coherent thing, but I define, at this moment, it doesn't matter what I think, and that's really the most difficult. I don't know how to give you a definition that would cut through what, let me just read you what Christopher Rufo wrote. I mean, you may have read it, but in case you haven't, it's worth understanding the degree to which this was an intentional intervention. Christopher Rufo, this is him in 2020, and just before Donald Trump picked up the same language and issued his executive order with regard. He said he's going to run a public persuasion campaign that will conflate any number of topics and deposit them into a new bucket called critical race theory. We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. And that's precisely what they've done. And they built that into the little addenda to various laws in those 30 states that you're talking about, that critical race theory is no longer any reference to anything that any of us may have written, and instead it is the feelings of discomfort that children may feel. And that's not a definition at all. That's simply something like cooties. So how would I define critical race theory at this point is like cooties. It's what children do to mark one another. It has no definition. It has some distinct undertone of sexual repulsion, smell, untouchability. But that's the closest you can come to the definition at this particular political moment, and that's really too bad.
I got an email from a lawyer in Utah saying he despised critical race theory. And I probably shouldn't have replied, but I did reply, right? And I just said, get in line. Because that's the point we're at, right? So, any more questions? Over here.
Thank you, Professor Williams. I'm in Professor Torres's class, and he's been making us so excited for your visit for like the past 3 weeks. So I have two questions. One, I'm really glad that you shared your sort of genealogy of writing, because one of the things that stood out to me about your legal analysis, like it's deeply creative, and you make like incredible use of wit and sarcasm. Like in one of your essays in The Alchemy of Race and Rights, you talk about, there's this like conversation you're having with your sister, you talk about polar bears, and it's so unexpected, but so smart and hilarious. And so I just wondered how wit and sarcasm became, it's also like in your column in The Nation, like it appears as well. Yeah. So I just wondered how wit and sarcasm became part of your writing. And the other thing that strikes me, so I'm a 3L here at the law school, and I read your work, and it resonates so deeply, and it feels so, it feels like it's something you just published yesterday. And some of these pieces you've published almost 40 years ago. And so how does it feel to have writing, analysis, foresight that feels so new when it's quite grounded in a different era, in a different time? I just wondered what kind of like...
I mean, I would like to say that I'm so proud of myself for writing something that is a stable truth. No, but what I actually feel is that I feel, a little depressed that it hasn't become anachronistic, that these observations are still ongoing problems, and that this discussion is something that isn't being heeded as much as I would like. In terms of, I'm so grateful that you find it witty and humorous, but it's, for me, it actually is joining things that I think are just absurd. It's not so much I've really so enjoyed listening to Anthony Kep, talk about her experience. She's just naturally witty. That's what I think of as wit. I think a lot of my descriptions are of scenarios that pull together things that are so unexpectedly bizarre, but they're real. And so I think that's a feature of the absurdity of the way in which race constructs us, and the way we hear and the way we see, that there is a profound absurdity to it. And when you really take it down to bare bones, it is kind of funny. I mean, it's that's what humor is, the unexpected joinder of two things.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's a last question. Over here. Back in the back.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia and Gerald. That was quite interesting. So I want to know, what do you think Derek Bell would say about this moment?
I told you so?
Yeah. I mean, Derek Bell, actually, I had many arguments with Derek Bell because I thought him much too pessimistic. And I told him that I was his research assistant. We remained friends for years. He was the one who pushed me to teaching. He was a good friend, and through my entire legal life. But he had a much more pessimistic view of where we were in this country in terms of race relations, and. You said it. He would have said, "Absolutely, I told you so." But and even to the extent that he invoked the metaphor of space.
Space, right?
He had the space traders come, and it maps so ridiculously neatly over the metaphor of now tech bros who's saying, we're going to Mars. We're going to leave you behind. And that is sort of startling to see how much his fantasies, his fiction, because this part of what he wrote were these fictive worlds, that are a little like Octavia Butler, but involved, the exchange. How are you going to escape from the planet Earth when, and so you trade away all the black bodies, And I thought that was cynical. I was wrong. I mean, to some extent. I mean, forgive me, but I'm sure I'll think my way out of this, but right now I think we're in a dangerous moment, and I'm a little depressed about it, so I wish I could give you a better answer, but I think that I feel Father Derek sort of patting my shoulder and saying, there.
But see, I think Derek would say, "I told you so," but he'd also say, "Don't stop struggling." I was blessed with being asked to write his obituary when he passed away, and one of the things you try to capture is both the bedrock realism with which he understood the world, which some people interpreted as cynicism, and some people interpreted as just as pessimism. But he was really trying to say what he saw, but he always saw a possibility for change. And that's, I think, that's the gift that he continues to give to us, I think. So Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you,
What a
Jared.
blessing. What a blessing for me.
So lovely.